Welcome and thanks for joining us today to this week 1 lecture in the course on gender in the context of mining governance. My name is Nora Götzmann. I work as a senior advisor at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, which is Denmark's national human rights institution. And it's my pleasure to be with you here today for the next 10 minutes just to share some of my reflections on why and how we need to get better at conducting gender-responsive human rights due diligence in the context of natural resources management. So I'll touch on some of the gender impacts issues that you've already been discussing this week, and we'll also hopefully reflect a little bit on how you can take some of that content when you're discussing or implementing gender-sensitive impact assessments. So that might be gender impact assessments, but it might also be when you're integrating gender into other types of impact assessment. And I'll be drawing in particular on a recent piece of work that we've done where we looked at how we might take a more gender responsive approach to implementing extractive industries projects. The first thing that I wanted to mention is that when we're speaking about a gender responsive approach, it's important to note that this is an approach that takes into consideration sociocultural factors that might underlie sex-based discrimination, but also, and critically, that it involves proactively identifying gender gaps and biases and planning actions to overcome those. And here, the type of gender equality that we're talking about is substantive gender equality, so not mere formal equality, but substantive gender equality as recognized in international human rights law. So we know from reality that women and men are often impacted differently by extractive industries projects, and I know that you've gone through many examples already in the course content. So frequently, women bear a disproportionate burden of adverse impacts, but at the same time, they might be less likely to share in the benefits that are generated by extractive industries projects. So here, for instance, we might think about agricultural livelihoods of resettled women being particularly adversely affected, whereas men who may have formal land titles may be the primary beneficiaries of compensation. Despite this, however, extractive industries companies frequently take a gender-neutral approach to human rights due diligence. So human rights due diligence is the process that's expected by the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And this is a process whereby companies know and show that they respect human rights. And they're expected to do this through assessing their potential human rights impacts, to take steps to avoid and address any impacts that may have occurred or that may be likely to occur in the future, to take steps to prevent any of those impacts occurring, tracking and monitoring their responses, reporting on their impacts and their due diligence processes, and engaging, of course, with stakeholders throughout that due diligence process. And it's important to stress that this is a whole of business approach. So we're not just talking about community relations, security management, local content, or particular areas of extractive industries projects. We're talking about a whole of business approach when we discuss human rights due diligence. And where we see companies taking a gender-neutral approach to human rights due diligence, we see two things. One is that women are often marginalized in stakeholder engagement and that their rights are therefore insufficiently considered in project planning and implementation. But we also see that companies actually miss out on a comprehensive understanding of the social context and their impacts on workers and communities and how those might be effectively addressed. So here, for instance, if we consider a baseline study that doesn't sufficiently account for how women and men might use resources differently, that can lead to an insufficient impact analysis, meaning that the company cannot actually effectively avoid and address any adverse impacts that it might be contributing to. So the argument that I'm trying to make to you in short is that despite some of the existing enterprise level commitments that we might see on behalf of companies or examples of project level implementation where we do see a more gender responsive approach, it's evident that on the whole, extractive industries projects need to take additional steps to make their existing commitments to gender equality and non-discrimination a reality. And here, really, that deepening engagement strategies with women and men in local communities is a really critical step towards that goal, and is really the essence of how you make gender responsive due diligence effective in practice. So just to share a couple of very brief examples with you today, I thought we could focus on 3 different topics and just a couple of illustrative examples for each of those. And the first one is really around community relations and stakeholder engagement. So here, some of the gender issues that we might see in practice include the participation of women in consultation and engagement. So for instance, women may be excluded from engagement activities, or they may be included, but then only as passive recipients of information. And this clearly is problematic because then their understandings, which may be different to those of men, are not reflected in the way that their issues are captured and addressed. But there may also be instances where the issue is around community liaison officers themselves. So for instance, is that men or women who are employed as community liaison officers and who take that frontline role? And then depending on the cultural context, is it appropriate or not for them to be engaging with women in local communities? Are they the most appropriate interface, etc.? So some of the good practice examples that we might be able to draw on here to address some of these issues are around developing effective strategies for gender responsive stakeholder engagement. So here to think about, have you considered what is the gender balance in the community relations team, for instance, and do they have the right skills to undertake the community engagement from a gender responsive approach? Have we designed some specific strategies that target women and girls in communities to ensure that their voices are heard in stakeholder engagement? So these are the types of questions that we should be asking ourselves when we're trying to implement a more gender responsive human rights due diligence. Some practical tools, for instance, gender context and power analysis or participatory mapping, can also be really helpful for us to understand what is the role of the different stakeholders in that particular context. What are the different requirements around childcare, the time of day, transport, etc. All of these practical things that would enable women to participate in stakeholder engagement activities. A second topic that I wanted to touch on is around livelihoods, land use and resettlement. And just a couple of highlights here, because this is a very detailed and in-depth topic that requires a lot more attention, but to draw your attention to just a couple of illustrative examples. One may be around women's and customary land rights. Another may be around compensation arrangements. So some of the issues that arise when we're considering women's and customary land rights from a gender perspective is that women may have limited land and inheritance rights. This might be particularly the case where voting rights are tied to formal land titles that women may not have. In terms of customary land rights, we may have issues where these are not recognized, so that women's customary land rights are not recognized. But in some instances, it may also be the customary land rights or practices themselves that point us to specific complexities from a gender perspective that we need to address. For instance, where customary land rights or practices exclude women from owning land or making decisions about land, or precluding them from participating in land-related decision-making processes. In terms of compensation arrangements, women may be excluded from designing or accessing compensation packages due to patriarchal legal or customary structures. So some examples might be that women's crops may not be valued, or that compensation may be paid out to a particular individual in the household rather than going to the household as a whole. So some strategies that we might be able to adopt to address some of these issues include really paying attention to women's participation in land-related decision-making. So this might include finding women's spaces, empowering women leaders, and also focusing on broad-based community participation when we're discussing land rights or access issues. And to view participation through a longer-term community development perspective rather than a short-term business perspective. This is really the bedrock to some of these issues. In terms of compensation packages, some of the things that we might be able to consider include gender-sensitive mapping of natural resource use, ensuring that ecosystem services and cultural heritage factors are covered from a gender perspective, and to, of course, involve women in the selection of resettlement sites and the planning process for resettlement, including the design of compensation packages and how those compensations may be issued. A last topic that I briefly wanted to touch on is around grievance resolution. And here it's important to stress that the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights do set an expectation that companies either provide or participate in avenues for access to remedy for those that may have been adversely impacted or whose rights may have been affected by a business operation. So some of the gender issues that have arisen in this space include that there have been specific barriers identified for women in terms of accessing non-judicial remedies. So they may not be aware of operational level grievance mechanism, or they may face particular issues in terms of fears of reprisals. This may be particularly the case for women human rights defenders who can be challenged for both being a human rights defender and also for taking a gender non-conforming role, if you like, or for challenging gender stereotypes by being a human rights defender. And we've also seen examples of lack of gender sensitivity in project level mechanisms, so where these fall short of international human rights standards. So very important here in this area when we're thinking about good practice strategies for enhancing gender responsive due diligence is to ensure that project level grievance mechanisms are implemented in a way that's human rights compatible and accessible to women. So ensuring that standard operating procedures and officers administering those have sufficient gender training. And ensuring that women are appropriately compensated for their losses where those are addressed through an operational level grievance mechanism. Using independent mediators with a strong gender understanding and including female staff within the community relations team, in particular as grievance officers, can be some strategies to assist us in this regard. So lastly, I wanted to wrap up by just touching on some reflections in terms of building on existing commitments and the next steps. And here, I think the main message that I wanted to get across is that we have existing commitments towards gender equality that we can draw on in the international system when we're working on this. And some of the primary frameworks that we can consider are the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which clearly emphasize the importance of taking a gender perspective, including through the UN Working Group Gender Guidance that was issued in 2019, which provides a common framework for states and businesses of how a gender responsive approach might be adopted. But we also have the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which places a clear emphasis on ensuring the rights of women and girls in moving towards sustainable development. So I think what it's really about now is implementation. How do we utilize those frameworks to drive implementation? And here, to conclude, to leave you with 3 thoughts as you move through the course over the next few weeks. The first one is, what type of existing resources are already out there that we can utilize in our practice? And here I would very much encourage you to have a look at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center Gender Portal, where there are a host of different resources that we can access to help us in our work. The second point is really around setting measurable goals and targets for how to achieve gender responsive due diligence and track implementation, to make sure that we put measures in place that can hold us accountable to what we have committed to. And the third one is around engaging in dialogue with relevant stakeholders. And here we can think about government, industry, civil society, and of course, importantly, rights holders. And in particular, I would encourage you to consider the steps that you might be able to take to engage with women and women's organizations, as well as gender experts where relevant, to develop a locally relevant approach to ensuring that the due diligence that we implement is more gender responsive.